Hello, welcome to Look Up with Licia, live Facebook video number 7. I'm Licia.Heath. I've put myself forward as an independent candidate in the upcoming Wentworth by-election, and my objective is to make myself as accessible as I can to the Wentworth community, not put anyone between myself and members of the community, and to give updates like this on what's been happening in my campaign, what I've been doing, questions I've been getting, and so forth. And this kind of live forum allows you to participate, ask questions as we go, or ask questions after the fact if you don't happen to catch the live video. I've been getting great feedback about running these, which is why I'm still doing them most nights, sometimes during the days, but it's a bit later than normal tonight because I have just returned from an event at the National Library run by the Grattan Institute, which was amazing. Actually, I'm very glad that I went. It was called Who's in the Room, and it was discussing the issues of the interwoven tendrils of special interests in our current political process. So it was over an hour discussion with academics, questions from the audience, talking about how government is working currently, or not working as the case may be, and what the main reasons for that are and what the solutions are as well. So I've just arrived back from it, and I'm still a bit fizzed up from the whole debate, and I might refer to notes more than I normally do, because it's all still fresh in my mind. But the whole evening opened with this whole idea of, or not idea, the notion that trust in our institutions, and in this case in our political institutions, is at an all-time low in Australia. And they shared different graphs and different measures, which I will share on this forum as well, to talk about, thanks for joining everybody, how trust has fallen away and why that is, and when trust falls away, what the consequences are as well. So the fall away of trust has happened over the last few decades, but has really plummeted since 2007, which is when Kevin Rudd first became Prime Minister, and that was kind of the start of what we know now as the revolving PM decade, which is clearly still with us. But how has trust and special interests kind of combined? Well, special interest, or vested interests, sometimes they're called as well, is this notion that behind the scenes there is this whole environment of political donations that is very opaque, that buys you access to politicians and potentially can buy you influence as well. Beyond donations, you also have lobbying. So what was 30, 40 years ago, a very amateur, for want of a better word, forum of lobbyists, of special interest groups. They might be not-for-profit groups, they might be religious groups. Now you have this advent of a very large new sector, relatively new sector, which is professional lobby groups. So there's over 5,000 lobbyists residing in Canberra today that weren't there 20 years ago. So you've got donations, you've got lobbyists, you have this, what they called revolving door of public servants joining lobby groups, lobbyists joining advisors to politicians, politicians joining lobby groups, and so on and so forth, such that currently I think it's 25% of ministers, of politicians, MPs, are ending up in lobby groups after their career finishes. So in the government relations department of whatever it happens to be, Crown, Ausgrid, Stockland, Minerals Council, you know, goes on and on and on. It's media. There is no sector that is immune, judging by some of the data that was shown to us today. So what happens when you have, which this Grattan report has just found out, that of the last financial year, there's basically 65% of political donations, this is to the Liberal and to the Labor Party, are untraceable. We have no idea where they've come from, to what extent they were lots of little donations or, you know, 4 big donations, and what influence they involved. So that leaves basically 14% that were transparent donations, as in they were clearly logged who gave them. And then the remainder is donations from fundraising bodies. So the large majority being undisclosed is a worrying advent, and separates Australia from a lot of other developed countries as well. And that affects trust. The trust the community has in how politicians are making decisions is utterly compromised when we have that sort of scenario playing out. Federal politicians are under no requirement to make public their diaries. That is different to state politicians. So New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland all have legislation and have their state-based ICAC equivalents, which is the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Their diaries are a matter of public knowledge because they represent the public, and they are paid from the public purse. Federal MPs are under no requirement to show their diaries whatsoever. Now, that doesn't mean that some don't, some do, but some don't. And there's nothing to require them to do so. So the whole look-through transparency of having a meeting with somebody, commensurate donations that might be happening through a period, and policy outcomes is utterly opaque at the moment. And when things are opaque, trust falls away from the system. And that is exactly what has happened. They gave a great example about some video piracy legislation that was coming up, was it late last year or early this year? And when that came up, Village Roadshow dropped $700K in the major parties' bank accounts, and the policy didn't get through. Now, I'm able to say that because that was all disclosed. Village Roadshow disclosed that. So do we have a problem with it not being disclosed, or do we have a problem with the process? Well, at this stage, I would say things not being disclosed is what we should have the major problem with, because we can then call into question how our politicians are making decisions and then make decisions on the politicians involved consequently. Currently, we can't. We can't do that at all. And I think that's a big problem. There's other ways to donate, obviously, and there's other ways to lobby that aren't as visible. So whether that's buying a $12,000 ticket to have dinner with the Treasurer, which is a fundraising exercise and which gets knocked up on the books as a fundraising exercise, that buys influence as well. So there's varying degrees of access and influence. And the point is that there is only a certain percentage of any population at any time that can afford that kind of access. And if the system is set up so that only those that can purchase professional lobby interests can undertake a special interest campaign, maybe a big media campaign, whether that be against a mining tax, whether that be against a union, it doesn't matter. The idea is that it's only money that can get you this kind of influence, then that's a problem for our system as well. And here we again come back to the breakdown in trust. So a couple of things to talk about are, last week, one of the videos I talked about was the concept of politicians, career politicians, and that risk-averse nature that can come with being a career politician. One of the academics said tonight that when the Rudd-Gillard era was the first advent of what we call university politicians entering, high office, and it's been that way ever since with all of our subsequent PMs, except Malcolm Turnbull, who was from the private sector and came in since. But in terms of front benches, people in cabinet, is that current population of that subculture of university politicians. And it would appear that that particular subculture of 15 years ago was a university politician is now a front bencher. Seems to be that they are not quite as resilient, this was this academic's view, they are not as resilient to pressures from external forces or special interests as possibly their predecessors were. Anyway, that was some food for thought. Some other food for thought that I thought was really interesting was they talked about when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, and there was the trying to get up the mining tax on the big miners. So a super profits tax on the mining industry, and the basically 6-week campaign that was heavily funded. They spent $20 million, I think the mining lobby groups that formed a coalition to try to take down the tax. They had $100 million to spend. It only took $20 million, and suddenly that whole concept of that tax was off the table. And again, one of the other academics discussed, for the public, when that was unfolding, if you polled their view on whether there should be a mining tax or shouldn't be a mining tax, at the start of the whole campaign by the Minerals Lobby Group, 52% thought there should be a mining tax. And at the end of the campaign, 47% thought that there should be a mining tax. So there wasn't a great shift in terms of public concepts of public's view on how the mining tax should play out. But what did shift markedly was the public suddenly had a sense of how special interest groups, how big they were now, and how they could completely scuttle and overtake views of our leaders. And that was what that campaign managed to do for public positioning. So why am I all fizzed up about all of this terrible news? Well, mostly because it's exactly what I have been forming my views on over the last few years, and it ties in exactly with how I formed my policy platform for my campaign, which is the idea that an independent federal ICAC needs to be established to look at the public service and look at our parliamentarians and ensure that there has been no corruption that has occurred through that process, really to instill trust back in the political process. My second platform is parliamentary reform. So significant reforms around how lobbying is conducted, how donations are conducted, whether that be cap on spending, whether that be real-time transparent recording of donations, which there should be, and also restrictions on terms of how lobbyists or parliamentarians can move from one sector to the other. So currently there is a restriction, and that is you have to be out of your, let's say, front bench position for 12 to 18 months before you can join a lobby group. That is the rule, but it's more a guideline. So you, that is broken all the time, and there is no consequence for breaking that. So completely different to the standards that voters, people that work in business, have to adhere to all the time. So parliamentary reform, a federal ICAC, and my third tenet to my policy platform is media reform. And that includes things like people within the media being used as vessels to spread special interest topics, or individuals within media being able to prosecute cases because they're not, because they're against some legislation that might be coming up. I also have views on tax reform, asylum seekers, the environment and climate change, many other things that I have views on as well, schools funding. However, as I've said in previous videos, unless we fix how our parliament is running and the lack of trust that exists in the system currently, you will never be able to prosecute cases to get through reform on any of those other issues that must be fixed first. So thank you for joining, everybody. Good to see you there. And please keep the questions coming through, and I'm about to share some of the slides from tonight's session. Thanks for joining Look Up with Licia. See you again.